Okay, so now we're recording. So this is our last summer meeting with the core advocates here in August. And I see that Sandra just jumped on, and I feel like it's kind of funny in a way that this is our last session for the summer learning. However, I feel like we just got to the point to where we're going to start going forward, and we're going to talk about that. And it's super exciting, and it gives me energy to kind of do that. So again, I've sent out some information for you all to look at, and we are like Twitter official today, which is totally excited. So we do have a Twitter account. We've set up some hashtags that we're gonna encourage people to use so that we can stay connected. We'll talk more about that. So let's just go ahead and jump into things this morning. So kind of for our warm up this morning, and I appreciate those of you in the chat that are kind of like, we have that habit now of when we jump in, we say, hey, this is who I am. So if you haven't given yourself an intro in the chat, go ahead and do so. And it's just a nice way to kind of remind us who everyone is and the different roles that we play across the state. So just as a quick reminder, the 3 things to stay connected to the core advocates through Student Achievement Partners is 1, to make sure that you sign up with Student Achievement Partners and sign up for their email. And then this Google form, I'm going to talk a little bit, but they send out that Google form of like, who's doing what, and do that. I did it just because I'm like, I want them to know that I value their work and kind of where we're at, and to keep that connection and that sense of community with them. And then all of a sudden I get this email that we're getting some swag, which we're going to talk about. So this is just a reminder here. We really only have 2 learning intentions this morning. And one is we're going to talk with Sandra, and we're so privileged to have her be able to join us as a resource, because she really has coached all of us up, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But when we do start talking about rigor, and I love this idea, I will probably use it forever, but this whole 3-2-1, so those are our 3-2-1 questions today around rigor. And so we'll get in, we'll have the conversation and the coaching up with Sandra, and then we'll talk about our next steps. And our next steps are so important because we've kind of been at this place, and I love Pete Hall. And if you all have never read any of his work or done anything, and I tried to pull it up here, but he has this framework that really connected all of the pieces for me to make me really realize like where I am in my own professional learning, with the information that I have, with the actions that I'm taking. And it gave me this framework, kind of helped me to have an appreciation of, at any given moment, I am with educators in kind of 4 different places. And so for a long time, we've been kind of unaware. When I came to the DE, I was unaware. So much information out there. And so I kind of feel like we've went to the conscious phase to where like now we have all this information, but now we're kind of on information overload. So now what do we do with it, right? Because information is great, but if you don't do anything with the information, kind of nothing happens. And we definitely want things to happen in Iowa. And so now I kind of feel like with the core advocates, we're kind of in between that transition of, hey, we know about these resources, we know how important they are, we've kind of learned and connected, but now how do we take it to the next level and kind of really get to that action stage, or what I incorrectly called it implementation stage. And so that was kind of where the guidebook came from, and we'll talk about that more this morning, but I kind of wanted to let you all know that that's kind of the structure and how you can frame it. So a couple of quick things are, yay, we are Twitter official today. So we have an account at Iowa Core Advocates, and some hashtags that we're going to encourage some use so that we can stay connected, especially with going back to the school year, is so Student Achievement Partners has 2 hashtags that they use, and one is hashtag Core Advocates, and one is hashtag Instructional Advocacy. And I kind of was like, oh, are they switching it? Like, I'm still getting schooled up on this whole how to think and frame all these different social media types. And it dawned on me that core advocates is really about a group of people, right? It's who is out there maybe doing the work, but instructional advocacy is the work that we're doing, right? Like, we want to advocate for good instruction. And then the Iowa hashtag Iowa Core Advocates, nobody was using that. So that is a really great thing. Kind of interesting though, when we set up the Gmail account last Friday, the first one was already taken. So Iowa Core Advocates, like IA Core Advocates, was already taken. So that's why if you're like, why did she put a 1 after it? That's why. I don't really know who used that. So we might discover who that person is someday, and that's okay. The next thing, so when I filled out that survey that they sent, and I try to do it in good faith, and I love when they send me the reminder email, because I'm like, it goes in my pile of things to do, but then I get the email from Janelle or whoever sends it, and I'm like, oh yeah, I need to do that, right? Because I want them to know like kind of where we're at, it helps them to kind of think of, hey, this is where they're at. How can we maybe support them, which is so appreciative. So they sent me some swag yesterday, which was perfect timing. And so one of the things that we're going to do is we are going to have a session at ICTM this fall for core advocates around mathematics. And we're going to use these for the giveaways because state rules, and why I wanted to announce this, because I did want to share this information, is I'm not allowed as a state employee to accept any gifts above $2.95. And so when I got all of this stuff, I was like, because I figured, I'm like, it's swag. It's something we're going to be able to use and be able to give away. I don't have to worry about it. Like, I'm sure they're not going to send me enough to where it's like, oh, right, I need to fill out a tax form for it. But anyway, so I laid this stuff out on my counter so I could take a picture and tweet it. And there was this little rolled up bracelet thing. And that's the thing that if you look at the image here on the bottom, and I'm going to just blow that up. And I was like, oh, it's like a little bracelet. I'm like, oh, that's fun. And then I was like, oh, it's kind of thick. And I opened it, and it's a USB bracelet. Like, it's got a little USB drive in it. And I'm like, oh, that's going to be hard to part with. But we're gonna do it. But I'm like, that's fabulous. Like, I just love that. And so we're going to have some cool little giveaways. So we will use that for the session. So I just wanted to put that little disclaimer out there so nobody's like, oh, she's taking gifts. No. Also, and if we have some time at the end, we can watch it, but Deidre, the infamous Deidre Baker, and I did get together to make the little video tutorial on TweetDeck. Kind of funny, we met in between of where we both live. And we met at I think it's the BP station, but they have like this little eatery in there. It was noisy as anything. So we're like, oh, we're not going to be able to do this recording. So it was literally a hot mess. And I say that because if somebody could have taken a picture of what Deidre and I looked like, we're in her minivan, hotter than Hades, at like 12:30 in the afternoon. Can't turn the air on because it's going to make sound, right? Have to have the windows rolled up because the semis are going by on 218. Hilarious. So anyway, I had to do some editing, which I did do in iMovie yesterday, and we got it uploaded. So if we have some time, we'll look at it, but it's on the slide deck, and it gives you a little walkthrough of how to use TweetDeck to stay sane in using Twitter, because it helps so much. So without any further ado, Sandra, I'm going to kind of turn it over to you. And while maybe you're giving us a little introduction of whatever you want to share with us this morning, for those of you online, if you can do the 3, 2, 1 in the chat, that would be awesome and amazing. So there we go. So you should be able to unmute yourself, Sandra.
Yep, got it.
Perfect.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome, very good. Okay, so agree, I thought last week was awesome, and it seems like a lot of the names that I remember back there from last week, a lot of you are back on today, so that's great. And excited about, let's just say, about April's excitement. I think that's, we kind of have our ideas at SAP about the work and educators, and I just feel like in the last few years with this work, we need to spread that excitement and that engagement. And so lucky for all of you in Iowa that you have quite a gem in April. Everyone should have such a person working at the state. So thanks for all your commitment over the summer. And we really do look forward to, what's ahead for all of you, how we kind of harvest this passion and this energy and this commitment into kind of what we very nonchalantly call, translating these shifts into action. I mean, that's our big goal at Student Achievement Partners, which is how can we make sure as many teachers as possible know what this work means, what the implications are of this work are, so that they can make good decisions and really see their efforts kind of translating into good effects for their students in their classrooms and the classrooms that they support. So we can talk more about the network. And I think from a content perspective, last week we talked a bit about focus and coherence, and I know you guys have been doing that throughout the summer. And I guess this week, the idea is to kind of give you my 2 cents about rigor, although I know this is something that's probably not too new to you, but just to kind of roll up again this concept of the shifts, focus, coherence, and rigor. It is like the heartbeat of these standards. We've all worked in standards based systems for probably most of our careers without really having these anchors of why one standard is there versus another standard. What's the kind of topography, if you will, of the work? And really knowing these shifts, this is kind of like this definition of college and career readiness in math. And rigor is a really important part of that. I say that with the qualification, however, that you can't really get to rigor if you didn't first get to focus and coherence. So focus, the idea of going deeper on fewer topics, which requires you to kind of get rid of some of the extra stuff that doesn't necessarily have to be taught in that year or build on that year. Coherence, making sense of the math, making connections across the grades, across the units. And with those things secured, then we think about rigor, which is, used to be, we thought about the types of proficiency and rigor as kind of a preference. Like some school districts, some school systems, some states even said, oh, we really don't care about kids like having accuracy and speed in math. We really instead want them to understand the math. Or, you know what, we don't care if they understand the math, we just want them to be fluent with those facts. And what these standards call for is that that isn't an issue of preference, that isn't an issue of, kind of opinion. If you are in fact going to be college and career ready, the math that you teach students, the math that you expect students to demonstrate, needs to attend to the 3 aspects of rigor. And those 3 aspects being conceptual understanding, not just for the smart kids that get the problems, but all students need to have, concepts of math. Second is this idea that there is procedural skill and fluency. And when we talk about, and thanks for the picture there, April, when we talk about procedural skill and fluency, what we're talking about is not memorization per se, but the idea that depending on what that standard is that you're working on, students have a strategy. A strategy might be a different strategy than the kid sitting next to them that they can go to reliably that gives them an accurate answer. And we kind of talk about this as, procedural skill and fluency means when you present that problem to a student, it doesn't present itself as a problem-solving situation. They know, they recognize it, and they know how to attack that problem. And then the third, of course, is application, which shouldn't be misinterpreted as word problems, because sometimes we give students word problems that aren't application problems. They are just kind of dressed up procedural problems. And the interesting thing is I see some of your questions in here about, how do I apply this to the classroom and so on, is that it would be a misunderstanding of rigor to say every single lesson or even every single math concept needs to address conceptual understanding, procedural skill and fluency, and application. So some of our math concepts kind of go across the years, and we usually think about fluency as something that develops as their conceptual understanding develops, as their experience with the concept develops, but not always. And some of the problems don't actually require procedural, some of the standards don't actually require procedural skill and fluency. They only require conceptual understanding, and the same could be said for application. And so you really need to take a look at the language of the standard itself to determine what is the emphasis in rigor. So language of the standard might say, use real world applications to do this math thing. Or it might say, understand that, and that probably a signal for conceptual understanding. Or it could just say, fluently, multiply. And obviously that's a good signal in there for fluency. And so when it comes to rigor and these three aspects of rigor, definitely take the language of the standard into account when thinking about lesson planning and therefore assessment design and everything else that accurately captures that aspect of rigor. I love this quote that someone just put in about rigor doesn't mean harder. It was probably my most responded to tweet when, I forget what session I was in what state and at what point in time, and everybody just kept saying, oh, we need rigor, we need rigor. And I hated that word. And if I kind of think back into the recesses of my mind, I think that I can attribute my aversion to the word rigor because I taught biology as a student, as a teacher, and I just had these images of rigor mortis and how many dissections I've done in my life. And so I just automatically push off that word rigor. But rigor actually means that, we have a tight connection between what we say we expect and what we actually do. So when I think of rigor in the standards in total, but certainly when we think about math proficiency specifically, it is this connection between what's going on in the classroom and what students actually need to know and be able to do. And so I appreciate this idea that it doesn't mean harder. I think that is another huge misread of college and career readiness or standards or anything else of the kind. But I think that one of the things that when we look at the typical curriculum, still some of them that are offered, many of them are pushed forward with one and maybe not the other two of these legs of the stool, so to speak. So some are really great at building conceptual understanding, but they don't specifically attend to this idea of procedural skill and fluency. Because we should just say that if that's what we expect, procedural skill and fluency, it doesn't happen by magic. We have to attend to it. And what has happened over the years is that a lot of the programs that push the conceptual understanding kind of assign procedural skill and fluency for the stuff that you could do at home. Do that for homework if your parents want to kind of work with you to do it. And so it's another opportunity where we're creating an unintended gap between who does that stuff at home and who doesn't do that stuff at home. So because these three things are things that we all care about in math, we need to invest classroom time to all three of these things with good intensity. And then the other kind of qualifying factor, oftentimes when we do PD around this, I love the nicks to the tricks. When we do PD around this, one of the things that we often ask teachers to do is kind of label, is this a problem that requires conceptual understanding or procedural skill and fluency or application? And really hard sometimes to separate those things, because when we think about teaching them, oftentimes we teach things procedurally that should be conceptual. It's a very common mistake that primarily primary teachers, when we give application questions, they label those as procedural skill, because we can probably remember, if we're not doing it ourselves, we know people who have, where it's like, I'm going to teach you how to solve a word problem. Step one, underline the verbs. Step 2, write down all your knowns. Step 3, do this. And now you're actually taking an application problem and proceduralizing it in a way that's actually robbing students of that ability to apply math versus applying a procedure. And so a lot of these things require us to really focus on the purpose of these 3 elements, but we shouldn't think of them as islands, but that they often flow together. As I said earlier, oftentimes the best way to develop fluency comes from a really strong place of conceptual understanding, and things that start off as very kind of conceptual end up becoming automated and look more like fluency down the road. So we can, I can share with April, and you can certainly find, I know April has the page set up that has just one of the many resources that we have available for this on Achieve the Core, but lots of good PD around rigor. But as I said, if you were kind of sharing this with a group of teachers, I would only do rigor after you do focus, because can you imagine saying, oh, there's these 3 parts of math, but they didn't first, kind of make way in the curriculum so that they could focus on fewer things. You've just taken, a little problem and made it really huge. I would also say that's another kind of plug for the math practices, really rich. Teachers can get really into those standards for math practice. But again, if you didn't start with focus, boy, you're taking a really challenging task and making it even more challenging by not giving them the opportunity to do that challenging work with fewer topics in front of them. So I'm going to kind of just scroll through the chat here and see if there's some more specific questions. If you all have any, please feel free to do all of that.
So while you're doing that, Sandra, it's so important, and it's something that I did not have a realization before, because when I got to the DE, and they did an amazing setup for me. They had already selected principles to action, and then they're like, is this the right work? I'm like, absolutely, this is the right work. And in going through the process of learning more, as we kind of prepared to do some other state work and bring Shelby in and get coached up, I sat there, and when she was sharing about the focus, and she told me, you can't, April, we can't skip on this. If we get this wrong. And I didn't have a deep appreciation for that. And then I was I came to the realization is actually a conversation I had with Tad from American Institute of Research, who's kind of assigned to me to make sure I don't break the state. And because he was a state lead forever, and he coaches me up, and we talk monthly. And I said, Tad, I almost think focus is even more important than the 8 effective teaching practices from principles to action. He goes, what do you mean? And I said, well, kind of like what you were saying, if I don't have focus and I haven't made room in my instruction to implement the 8 effective teaching practices, I just kind of made my job harder. And I could also be implementing the 8 effective teaching practices, and I could have great instruction, but if I don't have focus and I'm not hitting those things each year, those major works each year that the kids really need to be college and career ready, it's great. They learned a bunch of stuff, but it was not the stuff they needed, right? And so even throughout this process of my own learning, I'm oh, it's such a big deal.
Yeah. And I see the question that comes up often about hey, has anybody created the document where you take the standards and you highlight it? This is conceptual understanding. This is procedural. This is, application.
Oh, and highlighting the verbs, you mean?
Yeah. And so
oh, yeah, we've done a lot of that work in Iowa.
Yeah. So I think that is an excellent PD opportunity for teachers, whether in a PLC or what have you, just to take a look at the standards. Now take a look at your student learning objectives. And then finally, of course, take a look at the student tasks that you're asking them to do, and see if you are in fact getting to that aspect of math that's called for in the standards. This is, in addition to my aversion to the word rigor, I have probably equal, if not stronger, aversion, curiously enough, to the word alignment, because I think we've done it so poorly in this transition as well as in other transitions where we just say, oh, this standard is about fractions, this lesson's about fractions, this assessment's about fractions, but you could be completely missing the point if you don't get to this other rich aspect of math instruction, which is, in our verbiage now referred to as rigor. So even though someone could label it for you, actually that processing is really important to understanding the work. I know Shelby actually on our team has been leading some work with lots of organizations who are looking at test banks and that kind of thing and how they evaluate it for the aspects of rigor and what is the expectation. Should it be 33% in each of these aspects? And no, it shouldn't be exactly 33%, but it should definitely lead with the language of the standards. And I'll say maybe a bit more controversially that I think the same thing about DOK also. And so sometimes we think about assessments and task planning and everything as like, hey, how can we increase the DOK of this? And quite frankly, sometimes like, hey, do you know your multiplication facts? That's probably pretty low on the DOK. Doesn't mean it's not important. Doesn't mean kids don't really need to know that stuff. So kind of the way we talk about DOK is that also that the language of the standards should trigger that. Now, I'll say that in the standards that preceded these standards, that wasn't the case. We would use really broad language that didn't really describe student expectations as specifically as these standards do. So we actually needed that additional layer of DOK oftentimes, but I sometimes fear and often observe that people are saying, here's the standards, and now on top of the standards, I have to think about DOK, and on top of that, I have to think about this, when a lot of this stuff has already been built into the standards. And so rather than seeing these things as two layers, think about them as already sort of built in to the expectation. And what you want to make sure in thinking about DOK is, is the DOK level that's described in the standards the same as the DOK level of my instruction and my assessment?
Thanks for talking about that, Sandra, because I know my first exposure to really understanding DOK was when I was doing some of the work with the different Smarter Balance writing projects and stuff at our different, writing for the different levels. And so my lens around DOK was very much through the assessment lens of that's the cognitive complexity of what we're asking students to do through the assessment. And you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but can you give us just, and it can be your own insight or even Student Achievement Partners, kind of their unofficial philosophy or official philosophy if they have one, around DOK in when we're taking a standard and we're saying, oh, this is a DOK level 2. Do we really, is it correct to use DOK in the framework of instruction? Like, for example, I know I had one teacher reach out to me and she was like, can you help me understand DOK better? And it was actually from my old district. So it was okay. They're kind of like my little, my little nucleus of where I kind of think partner and experiment with them. But anyways, and their consultant knows that, but because they were like our administrator is grading us on the DOK level of our study hall and of our instruction. And they're like, and they're like, so can you explain more around the appropriate use of DOK or how you guys use it?
I'll say this, we don't really use it. That's different than saying we're against it and we think it's bad. We don't really use it because, as I said, I think the standards already take care of that. And so to introduce something else that's already baked into the standards seems, somewhat redundant, and it could get you off track. I will say one of the reasons why I think it's been very powerful in schools, and you just gave a perfect example, April, I can talk about DOK, whether I'm talking to a science teacher, an English teacher, an art teacher. I don't know study hall, you mentioned, I don't know how that happens. But, that idea that it's managerially convenient because it does cross conceptual content areas, I think is part of the reason why we see it used so much, which is different than saying, you know, I'm going to go in every single classroom across all content areas and look for procedural skill and fluency. You wouldn't do that, but it is an interesting thing to think about. No one has done it, and I don't recommend that they do it, that you think about these three types of, you know, demands of lots of content area. I can think about it as a former science teacher, for example. Like, do kids just know definitions? Are they able to recognize abstract concepts? Are they able to apply those abstract concepts and definitions to, you know, scientific problems? So I think it's harder to kind of talk about, you know, for example, these three aspects of rigor. The way we talk about DOK, you know, it's like the next thing after Bloom's taxonomy. You know, it comes from this place of, you know, wanting to be able to speak across curricula, but you won't see us talking about DOK as a separate metric. I know in the development of the Smarter Balance assessment that was one of the kind of criteria that they wanted to attend to when we started conversations 6-7 years ago now in like, what should the new generation of assessments look like? And we wanted them to be meaningful quality tasks. And so rather than say we wanted them to be meaningful quality tasks aligned to the standards, which we could have said, it was going to be this other metric in addition to content alignment. It was this additional kind of metric of criteria for how many of your questions are at which DOK, you know, but as I think April put in her comment, like some math actually doesn't require a higher level of DOK, which doesn't mean it's easy either, but it's also required depending on where students are in their progression with that concept.
Thank you for that. And rigor really helps me to kind of frame when I think make some connections around DOK. So when we look at the three different pieces, you know, conceptual understanding and applying that to real world problems, obviously that's at a much more cognitive demand. I mean, that's around a 3 or a 4. And, you know, where if we're just talking about skills and maybe fluency, maybe we're around 1 and 2. And oftentimes, like when we're talking about individual standards having a DOK level, and I said, well, if we're just talking kind of about the standard and we're just talking about the skill itself of an individual standard, it's really hard to get to DOK level really of a 3 or a 4 without taking those standards for mathematical practices around the communicating, reasoning, and problem solving and really embedding those standards into it. I'm like, that's kind of where we get to those higher, you know, level, and rigor helps me with that. So I appreciate you kind of explaining that. And when you were talking about rigor doesn't mean harder, a big topic here is I don't think fluency necessarily means faster either. So maybe that's something you guys can tackle.
I think that is true. That's why I like saying fluency kind of means it's not a problem solving situation. So for example, you could give a 5th grader, you know, a 3-digit by 3-digit multiplication problem, and they are not going to memorize the answer. They will need a paper and pencil to solve that problem. It could take them some time, but they should spend almost no time in figuring out how to solve that problem. Different kids might do it differently. You know, there's lots of different algorithms that one might use for that problem, but every kid should know which algorithm works best for them so that they can just attack that problem with speed and accuracy. And I don't mean speed like compared to the next kid, but I mean it's not a problem-solving situation. There's a clear pathway to get to it. I think probably the most challenge, and when you see the most inconsistency, is when it gets to the idea of application. And when I kind of very quickly breezed over this idea that application doesn't mean word problems, because I would almost bet, you know, not knowing any of you personally or what schools you're working in or what curricula you're using, you could take a look at the textbooks in the classrooms in your schools and look at word problems and find that the majority of the word problems are just procedural skill and fluency. When a word problem comes at the end of a set of tasks that students are doing that are, you know, naked tasks, just straight up problems. And then that word problem only asks them to do the same thing, just hunt and find those numbers, but they're applying the same exact operation, same exact process. You know, we fool ourselves into thinking that that's application, but it really is not. So application is a very much like the math is unlabeled, it's unknown. Students have to really understand what the task is that's described in front of them in order to really apply, you know, what operation, what problem solving, you know, element, what of the math standards, conceptual, procedural, do they need to engage in order to solve that math problem? And that is, you know, so ripe for improvement that if, you know, again, if you're looking at like little things to really go back and say, oh, let me check how we're doing on this, you know, how you address word problems, application, conceptual understanding is probably really an interesting conversation to have with your peers.
I have one last thing for you, and then I'm going to turn it over to those online for questions that they want to put in the chats, or their 3, 2, 1s or other things. So we often hear the math wars are over, right? And so it's about both that skills and students thinking, right? Both are equally important. And I was kind of looking for that little, it's like an 8-second like little video GIF or whatever, where it's got the 3 little gears and it shows the balance of all 3 of them. I couldn't find it this morning. That's why I was clicking around. But one of the things is right, wrong, or indifferent. So a student has a worksheet, has 20 problems on it, right? So 1 through 19 is just skills and procedures. And then, you know, a lot of our resources just slap that word problem on there, which isn't necessarily, you know, an application problem, but they just slap it on there. And so how is being in the classroom, how do we kind of balance that rigor aspect? Like, I mean, is it kind of 50-50? Like, you know, when I'm giving my students like practice time or homework or whatever, should it be kind of 50% skills and procedures and then 50% of the, you know, around the rigor with the application and the, like that, like, I mean, I don't know. I don't have a verdict, or like, I haven't thought about it, but it's the one thing that kind of comes to my way. Like, is this a, you know, is this a good tool to use? I'm like, I don't know.
We talk about it with this idea that may not be that clear of, you know, that we attend to those 3 aspects with equal intensity. That doesn't mean equal number of problems. But as I said, if the concept requires all 3 of those things in development, then we have to give students opportunity across a unit of instruction to do all 3 things. So much of this is also context dependent. So, you know, in some communities, it is perfectly the right thing to do to say, hey, procedural skill and fluency, do that at home. Your parents will help you with it. You can have flashcards. Maybe it's a, you know, one-to-one technology district, and they have, you know, computer games that basically do flashcards or whatever it is. Like, you can do that. One of the things, like, you know, Jason, for example, recommends is if your math curriculum has changed significantly, we'll say in the name of Common Core, and it is much more conceptual, there are many communities where parents are like freaking out. You may see some of this stuff on Facebook where they're like, what is this new math? Like, maybe that's the work that you do more in the classroom, and then send the more traditional stuff as part of homework. As long as, you know, you're attending to all 3 things. So there's lots of different ways to do it. Certainly procedural skill and fluency requires a lot of practice and less guidance. And so it does make sense to do some of that stuff at home, but not with an unaccountable way. You know, in my own kids' school, and they're well beyond multiplication now in their education, although when I started this work, they were in, I think, 1st and 3rd grade. And it was literally like, yeah, we are not working on multiplication facts here. You can do that at home. But one nice thing that my school district does now that I really like, although I found out that I'm like in the minority of really liking it, is every week, starting in I'm going to say 4th or 5th grade, all the way up through high school, they get, like, in addition to whatever the unit of instruction is that they are doing, they get what they call a skill sheet. And it's, gosh, it could be math from 2 years ago, it could be math from earlier in the year, but it is like this kind of like grid of problems all over the place of, you know, where it came from, whether it's a geometry thing or a multiplication thing or a division thing, whether it's just a straight up problem or an application problem or what have you. And it's just something they have to do on a weekly basis. I love it because I think it keeps kids like with this idea of understanding rather than just repeating a procedure that they're learning in class. They really have to engage, you know, the math that they have truly learned rather than, you know, memorized and that kind of thing. So that kind of additional, rather than just thinking about your curriculum as, you know, very linear, is a way that I've seen and actually experienced this kind of coming into play.
Okay, great, thanks. I want to open it up to either you can look through the chat and see. I know there was one, I kind of put it in the chat again just to bring it to your attention, but is there anybody online that wants to unmute themselves and jump in and ask Sandra some clarifying questions, or, hey, what about this? Just feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. Sandra?
I really love this idea of not robbing students from doing the math. We're little plug, we're for our September Core Advocates webinar, which is the first Wednesday of September from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern time. We're doing a webinar that's basically called like Who's Doing the Work in Math? And it's very much this idea of keeping track of how much math is the teacher doing at the front of the room and how much math are you actually giving students, you know, the opportunity to do, and what are some of the kind of almost canned strategies that you can build into your classroom procedures to really encourage that math dialogue, discussion, having kids doing math problem solving rather than it always kind of filtering through the teacher. So I think that will be really interesting and exciting, and it's a new topic that we are, you know, kind of stealing from the literacy side of the house, where they talk about who's doing the work in literacy and, you know, what do classroom discussions look like, and then we're saying, yeah, that totally applies to math also. So we're doing it for math in our September webinar, which they're all recorded, and so even if you can't make it to the actual live webinar, you can always see the archived version, and I think we do have a webinar from the past on rigor in math as well that you can take a look at.
Yeah, I think Shannon had a question and she was jumping in.
I was curious, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just curious if you have heard of the ANET or Achievement Network.
Yep.
And do you guys work at all with them, or are they kind of their own separate thing?
Yeah, so Student Achievement Partners has been working, oh gosh, I'm going to say we're kind of closing out our 3rd year. One of the grants that we have, because we're almost completely grant funded, we're starting to venture into the not grant funded work now, but we've been for all the years of our existence completely grant funded. And so one of the grants that we have is with a funder that gives grant money to a group of organizations. ANET is one of them. The New Teacher Center is one of them. They do a lot of teacher mentoring. New Leaders is one of them. They do a lot of prepping people to become administrators, particularly in large urban districts. Leading Educators is another one, really interesting group that works on teacher leadership. And what our role has been in that grant is to have, TNTP is another big organization that's part of that, is to have those organizations take a look at their products and services and what difference would it make if they really understood what the standards called for and have that actually influence their work. So yes, ANET is an organization that was very much kind of like standards based, and part of their impact was like, here's a standard, test the standard, here's a standard, test the standard. And they had like a really aha moment as they kind of learn more about the standards, about like, oh, hey, these standards might not so well lend themselves to, here's a standard, drill it, here's a standard, drill it. You might have to like revisit standards, and you might not just test on one single standard at a time, but a group of standards at a time. So they have really augmented a lot of their work to better influence this. One of the great projects that we've been working on with ANET is, how do you use, kind of going back to last week's conversation, how do you use that coherence map and understanding of these, you know, aspects of rigor and expectations of the standards to effectively plan response to intervention, or multi-tiered, whatever we're calling it these days. And so ANET and SAP have kind of developed that, and that's one of our archived webinars, if that's of interest to you. We did that maybe in April or March. If you look up on our archive webinars, that was a really great webinar, and we did that in collaboration with ANET.
What did you say the name of that webinar was?
What's that? I'm going to guess just off the top of my head, thinking about timing, that it was either March or April. But if you look on our archives of webinars, you'll find it in there. It was really, really well done. Oh, so no, so that rigor in math, it was a different one. It might have been supporting struggling students in math. That might have been the title of it. Supporting.
I was thinking that was in March, the supporting, oh, there it is, supporting all learners, that one?
Yeah, the March one, yeah. My memory wasn't too far off. So that's just a good example of something that we're doing with ANET. But again, you know, I don't know the organization really well. When we do these interactions with them, we work kind of like with the people at the highest levels of planning and development, and then the degree to which that trickles down to all of the coaches and that kind of thing, you know, we don't exactly know.
I watched that webinar, so I'm guessing that's probably where I got the ANET resource.
Yeah.
But I had forgotten that where it came from or where I found it. So thank you.
And Shannon, you bring up a really great point, and that's something that we're going to talk about. And I hope Sandra sticks around. If you have time, you're welcome. Don't feel like, because this is like maybe a, you know, like just Iowa educators talking about this, that you have to piece out. So one of the things is what to do with all this incredible amount of information that we're on, and how do we kind of go from, hey, now that I know about something, and how can I start to use that and put it into action and implementation. But before we kind of transition, because of time, I do want to allow anybody else who wants to jump in to either jump in or put comments in the chat. I know Sandra would be open to, in the future, we're still working on the logistics as far as how do we keep this conversation going, continuing to grow and continue throughout the year as we all go back into our regular teaching roles, and it's not summer break and stuff, because this is really, those of you that have, just the fact that you join in on the summer months, I mean, that says that you're a leader. And kind of like when Steve was here and he's like, you know, outliers, I was thinking about that, because I'm like, yeah, we're kind of outliers when you do stuff like this. So I don't call them outliers, I call them leadership. But so
just for fun, to that end, a video that we often show to our core advocate networks, you can probably find it, you know, if you just Google it. It's called The Lone Nut. I don't know if any of you have seen it. I have my doctorate degree in educational leadership. This is like a really quick video, maybe. Oh yeah, there it is. This is the best example, April, of what you just talked about.
Sorry.
Every time I watch it, I get goosebumps, and I'm a nerd about educational leadership, and this is probably something that somebody just like very poorly produced, but so powerful, and a great way actually to talk about kind of teacher-led networks. I love it so much.
Is this the one where they're dancing, like they're on the hill and like one person? Okay, all right. When I looked at it, the lone nut plus one follower equals a movement, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, I've seen that before. It is fabulous. It's so true, right?
And so basically, what it says, I mean, I remember, you know, I've gone through, I think as April introduced, like a lot of different positions in education, and you know, like for example, I remember when I was a subject area supervisor, and you know, one of the first things I did was like, you know, reorganize how students were scheduled in middle school and high school science. And one of my colleagues said, "Hey, who said you could do that? I didn't know you were allowed to do that, or propose a new course. And who said you were allowed to do that?" And so you always find yourself like doing what's right, even if that's not what everybody else is doing. And then people could either kind of follow it along with you or not. And so this is, you know, part of that kind of idea that, you know, it always starts with one nut, but it's actually not that one nut that's important, but who's following that nut. So don't be afraid to be that lone nut, but for sure, don't be afraid to be the first follower, because, you know, the kind of punchline of this video is that, you know, if that one lone nut just stays as a lone nut, and you could just kind of see it on the screen here, and no one follows him, and he's just like out there dancing without a shirt on in the middle of a park, that's nothing. But as soon as there's a second person dancing with him, you know what's going to happen, right? And you can just like kind of watch a little bit of this video here. You know what's going to happen, which is then there's 3 nuts, and then there's 4 nuts, and then all of a sudden. And so when I think about particularly like this idea of a core advocate network, imagine if what everybody was like dancing about here was rigor or focus or coherence. It's like, yes, I'm going to do that. Well, I'll do it too, and I'll do it too. Like, you know, that really maybe reveals too much of the nerdiness of me in this work. But that, to me, that's the dream of what teacher-led networks are. Like, imagine if what we really engaged around was getting, you know, good materials in the hands of students, and, you know, there's a couple brave souls out there, but then everybody else kind of does it along with, and that what made somebody feel like an outsider is not doing the good work, versus all of this crowd now are the ones doing that good work. So that's why I love this video so much.
I love it too. And it's it really is a great illustration of many of us are in our current roles, even if it's from a teacher leader point perspective, or instructional coach, or AEA at higher ed. And yeah, I really spent a limited amount of time in an official like instructional leader, but I was kind of always that outlier. My principal was like, I was the crazy nut. They're like, what is she doing now? What do you mean you want all the individual desks out of the classroom and that you want tables? Like, nobody wants tables, you know, it's a hassle, blah, blah, blah. What are you going to do on testing days? I'm like, I'm going to go buy some foam board from Walmart and make little quad things that are collapsible and tape them together. And like, we'll just put them up like little partitions, like, you know. And I was always that crazy nut. And then, you know, then now they're like, how did the nut end up at the DE, right? It's like, yeah.
What do principals do with the nut? Like, what I love about them is that it, you know, are we containing them, or are we, and maybe each of us are our own versions of lone nuts, are we in fact seeking out those first followers? Because that is really, I mean, I know you guys do so much about teacher leadership in Iowa, but this idea of what are you doing to cultivate that first wave of followers, that's the leadership work. It's not about being just that brave soul dancing on a hill. It's about what are you doing that inspires it. And, you know, of course, you know, that video, the audio that goes with it talks about so much of what we talk about in our Core Advocate Network. Find something that people can do. If that lone nut was not doing a crazy dance and doing like, you know, ballet on point, you know, people are not going to follow that. That is intimidating. That is scary. That takes a lot of skills. But what if, you know, it was about, you know, doing, you know, application problems that you were sending home, or fluency, or classifying your curriculum according to focus, whatever the thing is that you have a tool for, there's a model for it, it's easy to follow, you know, there's some of that in that, and it's very much informs like what we think about with this network. That's also why, by the way, we don't say like, what is this network about? Do all the standards. That's not easy to follow either, right? So what is the thing that Iowa might think about that best supports this work, but that is easy enough to follow that you can cultivate that first wave of followers? So
Yep.
kind of get a bit of a soapbox about that.
No, it's great because right now I think, just the fact that, and even network, I'm really starting to transition my thinking and my framework around a community, right? Like, I mean, that's why we get on Facebook, and that's why we have these different things, right? We're looking for that community. And now with technology, we can find those other people that are like us, that are maybe across the state or across the, nation. And so it's really, so next steps, just because of the sake of time. So one of the things that I have struggled with since I came to the DE was one, I ended up there kind of as an outlier or the lone nut, whatever. And I was like, oh, there's a whole bunch of information. So then all of a sudden I had this urgency, like as I'm going to SCAS and as I'm talking to people like Sonder and different things across the nation and, being connected to ASSM, I'm like, oh my goodness, how do I take all this information and make sure that my AEA consultants have it and my higher ed leaders have it and my teachers leaders have it? How do I make sure they have the information that they might need or want, right? So then it's been information vomit. Like, it's been like, as soon as I find out something and I want to make sure like they know about it, I throw it to them, as soon as something comes across or whatever, because I'm like, I don't want them to ever be in the position where they don't have the most current information, but we are on information overload. So kind of to transition from that, all of that information, kind of now, what do we do with it all? And I'm like, well, we just keep creating these different organizational tools. Like we have a Symbaloo, or maybe we have a Google site, or we have a collection of websites or whatever, right? And so I really started looking at, people don't even know what information, where to start, how they might frame it, what might they start to look like. So one of the things, and I'm kind of on the fourth or fifth one, so you guys are getting kind of a little bit of a preview. And I'm sure I stole this idea from somebody, because most of what I do, I steal from others. And just before, real quick, and it'll be in one of these guidebooks. But so I stole an idea from Christina Tondevold. And, I attended her virtual math summit and and I was just like, oh, and kind of working with you and having this weekly thing, which, we're going to transition into a month. We have a monthly plan and everything, but I was like, oh, well, what if some things around, like, now that we need to kind of learn more about meaningful tasks, what if I just invited some people to join us and do a webinar? And so I threw out some emails to a bunch of the gurus, and they were like, sure. I was like, really? So we kind of got confirmation from Dan Meyer and Graham Fletcher and Robert Kaplinski and the guy, which one doesn't belong, Christopher or whatever. And we have some other ones we're trying to work out. And so every month we're going to kind of feature that. So Janelle had put something in there about Robert, and so I wanted to share that. And so that was just kind of like, hey, let's make this connection. So kind of great there. Another thing is we have these guidebooks. And why a guidebook as opposed to like a website or whatever? I don't know about you, but when I'm on a website, if I get further than 2 layers into a website, I kind of forget where I'm at, or like, a bright shiny object over here. I always wanted to know about that. And it's kind of like getting on Pinterest, which I did once in the last 2 hours of my life, is where I would never get on Pinterest again. So too many bright shiny objects. So this is kind of the guidebook for our community. And so at any time we're going to kind of update this, and we put this little recently updated in this guidebook. So this is going to be dynamic. So to cut down on some of that information blasts with the emails and stuff like this, if you're on the list, you're going to get this, or, I sent it to you, and you can just quickly scroll to see our table of contents. And then you can do some people are like, we need to be able to search it. So, you can do the Apple F or Control F or whatever it is. But this is going to kind of be like our one-stop shop. So where we're going to, as we go through this, how do we keep track of this learning, right? And so this will be kind of our own Iowa guidebook. We're still working on it. And you can go through here, like some of you, I sent out the invite. Some of you have joined the G+ group already. Great. As I said, we had to put the 1 in it. We are working on, and it's new. It's going to be different than the one we used for this one. But this is going to be for our whole network, ELA and math. And and I think I sent something to SAP on Friday saying, hey, can I have a graphic like everybody else has a graphic? And so I was like, I can make a graphic. And so I kind of played around with paint and I got kind of good at it. So we have our graphic now and we have it all over our stuff, which is kind of fun because you'll see it's on our Twitter account. So the SAP newsletter, kind of what were the original states that went through this. SAP, I attended their monthly webinar. They've got some cool stuff coming out to kind of support this work over the next couple of weeks. So that's why I didn't get too far ahead of like, I don't want to recreate the wheel. I don't want to use my time to think about things that they are collectively thinking about and going to do way better than I can. So, so right now, you can see, so we've got both the sign up form. So ELA is ramping up. We've got our Iowa Core Advocates. We've got Lee Belleville right now on the steering committee because Lee has actually been she's been connected at a little bit of a higher level than most of us as far as she's been connected with the other state core advocate leads. She's been doing some PD around it. So it made sense for ELA to kind of have her be the lead. And so she's going to actually run our Twitter. And so you'll see in our little, like, we have branding now, right? We have, so we're going to do some Twitter chats. We're going to look at doing some slow and fast ones. So we're just kind of getting this plan all together. It's kind of funny. I'm starting to have, again, a deeper appreciation for hashtags and how can we keep this community and communication going even when we return back to school. And I'm sorry, because this was the last one. We are over 10. If you need to peace out, we're recording it. We'll upload it. My apologies. But I just feel like in the last week, we made a lot of great connections. And I just want to thank you all because there were probably some times when you joined in and maybe before on the ones Sandra didn't come to and you're like, she don't know what she's doing. She doesn't have a clue. And we were sorting out, we were being very, like we wanted to capture the energy that Shelby kind of started around the core advocates when she came in April. And then I went in May and we didn't want to just be like, oh, we're going to put it on the back shelf. Like we wanted to keep that conversation going. But then from the DE level, it was kind of like, there's always that slippery slope of what can, kind of. So we really have kind of gotten to the point of where we kind of have some questions answered and kind of have it mapped out to where really mine and Destiny's role is going to be supportive. Like Lee's going to manage the Twitter account. That's kind of in her wheelhouse. She was really passionate about it. She brought in her own graphic. And she can connect to the other states and kind of get that conversation going. And so we're just really supporting her. Like the conversation is like, hey, if you get too busy and you can't keep that conversation going, let us know. Then, we can reach out or we can help support you. So our role is really around support and just creating these spaces like hashtags. So we kind of have some things in there to where we can have a slow chat. And nobody's using this hashtag. So, Iowa Core Advocate. I think it was, where did I get? Instruction Network Slow Chat. And I think I meant Instructional Network or something. And so these hashtags are, which is great because then we can have these little hashtag conversations and like you go to these pages, there's nothing there. And so we are going to have a monthly webinar and we're kind of working on, as I said, it got to the point where I needed to even have my own guidebook. Okay. So I have my own for everything across the state. So we have this little, let me see if I can. Oh, that's the planning document. See, you just get all this stuff and you're like, where did that go? What is that thing? So kind of our series that we're kind of four pockets. So here's kind of our gurus that we're Andrew, Tracy, Fawn. And then our principles to action, we're gonna focus on a different practice. But then we kind of working on, this is just tentative of like, how can we now take this learning and then go forward and continue this and do it on a more monthly basis and get to some of these these other things that maybe we didn't get to because we were, you know, an hour once a week. It's just not a lot of time. And then we're hoping to bring in some of the nonprofits, like Ed Reports comes up a lot, and just some of these other ones. So that's something that you might find in there that you like. Let me go back to the which, hang on here. I have too many tabs open here. I work in lots of tabs. It's just how I roll. Oh, let me go back to that'll help me to go back to here, and then I can find it here. And this is part of one of the things, like, where's that folder? What's that in? Who did I? So anyways, I would encourage you to explore this and give us feedback, right? Because we really want this to be a user tool for those of you that are going to continue on this journey. And then hopefully then as we get the little, you know, within your school, within your AEAs, within your higher ed, what's kind of going on. And so, and then we've got the YouTube channel in here. So continue to explore. We'll have more information coming up, but that's kind of our next steps. It feels a little more real now. It feels like we've kind of got it together, that we're going forward, right? And, you know, if you're a teenager then, and you get into a relationship with somebody, it's like, oh, it's Facebook official. And it feels, right? And so I use that, and I'm like, oh, it's Twitter official. Like, we're all in this kind of relationship community if you have them.
April, at risk of extending the conversation a little bit, I just want to put in one plug, and I'll say this with all the love as an outsider, is that as a group, one of the things that's going to be so powerful, if you just keep thinking about that visual of the lone nut, is rather than saying, I'm going to share all this information with everybody who I ever talk to, like, that is a lot of information that might be really good for the leadership group within this kind of like Iowa broad network.
But not for everybody.
But not for everybody, right?
Right.
So if the first thing you did is go back to all the teachers that you work with and give them this guidebook, like, I promise you, nothing is gonna happen because it will just get lost. Now,
no, this is just for our group.
Right.
This is, yeah.
The reason why this is so important for you as a group is because you might need to do this amount of self-study to decide what is the narrow specific thing that Iowa teachers are going to engage around. And if you stopped at focus and you didn't even know anything about coherence, or you didn't know anything about rigor, maybe you're going to miss the mark about what is the thing that's so important. So as you kind of go through this leadership study about the content, really think about what is the, you know, pain point, you know, yeah, what Dan Myers, what is the headache that teachers are feeling right now? What is the thing that will have good impact on student performance, student achievement in classrooms? And make an informed decision about that using a lot of these tools and resources so that you can get to a well-articulated, like, narrow campaign is what we call it, but narrow initiative that you can use to engage teachers across the state in the dance, if you will, of this idea of improving instructional performance in classrooms. So, you know, just wanted to contextualize, like, the lots of information versus the narrow specific information. And then, you know, focus is your friend in this. It's actually hard, but focus is going to be your friend in this. And so one of my kind of like parting little phrases, although I know we will certainly meet again and speak again, is that it is not our job as instructional leaders to make this work easy. It is not easy work, but there's a huge difference between simplifying something and focusing it. And that part of it as leaders is our job, to focus the work, but not to simplify it. So think about the difference between those two things, and I think it'll help you all in what I hope to continue interacting with you all around as you grow this amazing Iowa network.
I want to thank you so much for being willing to go on this journey and helping us kind of as we learn, because this really is going to be the core group, and what you talked about, that focus and what really our campaign, it will come from the group. It's not going to be, you know, something that, it's not going to be something that DE does to them, or, you know, we want to make sure to remain supportive. And if we need to create that space, if we can, you know, somehow get support or those sorts of things. That's definitely, so as we kind of continue to enact from our summer, now that we kind of have had those conversations. So ELA, I know, is going to be kind of ramping up, you know, and so we're going to look for a way to kind of, how can we come together and have what Sandra mentioned, that focus around a campaign. Like, what is the work that we really feel that we should focus on that can have the greatest impact for Iowa students? And that's going to come from you all, because you're in the field, you're doing the heavy lifting, right? I mean, it's not heavy lifting to set and make a tool to be able to, you know, collect all that information, but really you all do that heavy lifting. And yeah, you all are what make the impact for students. So thank you so much, Sandra. And I know we will talk again, and I'll kind of talk to you about those fall webinars and kind of see, you know, as we kind of get some more direction. And so a last plug, sign up for the Student Achievement webinars. I put some links in here just around the 3. I find myself just continuing to go back to these 3. And I think Sandra, yeah, oh, no, she's still here. Good. I was like, okay, you're welcome, Sherry. But so really just around these 3 things and continuing learning. So with that, we are at about 10:11. Does anybody have any like parting questions, parting comments, thoughts, takeaways, things that you want to share with the group? Oh, you're welcome, Rob, but some work's going to be coming your way with higher ed, because you're definitely going to be the leverage for that, and how can we bring that higher ed in, you know, to that conversation, and maybe how Iowa AMTE, Shannon, you're going to be, you know, how can we kind of create that sense of communities across the state, you know, and kind of connect everybody. So you guys are awesome. I couldn't do any of this learning without you. It would just be like, what do I do with it now? So, oh, good. Thank you so much, Sandra. She put her contact info, and make sure that, like, I tried to tag everybody in Twitter. And if you didn't get tagged, it's because I don't know what your Twitter handle is. So if you go into our, here we go. Oh, let me go to the home. So if you go into the tweet, so it looks like we put out another little tweet, but then if I go to mine, and so if I didn't tag you in this tweet here, as far as Twitter official, because I tried to go through the list this morning, but if I didn't tag you in this, it's because I don't know what your Twitter handle is. I've lost it. You probably told me. So yeah. Oh, awesome, Sherry. Look at that. Yay. So see, I'll retweet that and put that in our hashtag Iowa Core Advocates. Oh, yay, Shannon retweeted it. So awesome. I love it. All right, so you all let me know questions, comments, concerns. We're going to continue to go forward. And Sandra, if you have just a couple of minutes that you can give me after everybody pieces out, I just wanted to follow up with you real quick since we were both online. If you have time, if not, no problem. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your last couple of days of summer. Some of you are back. I know it went so fast. Seemed like just yesterday we did Principles to Action, and now we're like, people are tweeting about being in, you know, orientation in districts. I'm like, oh, it always goes so fast. So, all right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to hit stop record.